Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for Data-Driven Security Reloaded. My name is Raleigh Gould, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Our featured speaker is David Monahan, Research Director, Risk and Security Management at Enterprise Management Associates. David's in-depth security experience, which spans over 20 years, has included organizing and managing physical and information security programs. He has contributed content to a wide variety of industry forums and periodicals, including State Tech, CIO, CSO, and Computer World magazine. And before I hand things over to David, I did want today's audience to know that while we will defer answering your questions until the conclusion of today's event, we do encourage you to log them at any time throughout the course of the presentation using the Q&A functionality located in the right-hand column of your screen. David will spend the last few moments of his presentation answering your questions, so I do encourage you to take advantage of that opportunity. Also, today's event is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email from Enterprise Management Associates tomorrow that will include the on-demand playback as well as some additional resources. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our featured speaker, David Monahan. David?
Thanks, Raleigh. I appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. We're glad you could come to the webinar today. We have some pretty exciting information to share with you, so I hope you all have put your seatbelts on and you're ready to go. The first thing I'd like to do, though, is thank our sponsors for the research. Bit9, Prelert, and Dalbala all were supporting parties in this research. Without them, we couldn't have been able to bring you this information, so we really do appreciate their sponsorship of the event here. First of all, to give you a little background on the research itself, we had 207 survey respondents that were primarily North American-based. They were across multiple areas and verticals, including manufacturing, healthcare, pharma, education, government, and a number of others as well. We did also collect information across mid-markets, enterprise, and SMB size organizations, so we could look at that information. So we were able to get a really nice cross-section across multiple verticals, as well as being able to look at it from a size perspective and seeing what the organizations were doing for tools in those areas. One of the key aspects of the survey is we didn't go for a huge quantity. We wanted to go for quality of results. So we focused in on IT, security, risk, fraud management personnel, both in the operations and in the administration or management sectors. And I think this is important because we felt that we really wanted to tune in with the people that gathered data, used data, and then ultimately were responsible for interacting and using it for security. So let's get into some of our findings. First of all, one of the things that came up as post the year of the breach, and you'll probably hear me refer to that a number of times, is that people are less confident in their ability to detect security issues before they become a significant issue or have a significant impact. And you can see across the years here, we started out with our first study in 2012, and roughly 71% of the respondents said they were somewhat confident in to highly doubtful of their ability of detecting an event before significant impact. In 2014, when we ran their report, it was 69%, so very similar, but not exactly the same. However, you can see significant rise in that lack of confidence, right? So organizations are now moved to 79%, and that's bad. However, I think at the same time, there's a positive aspect of that is given all the issues that we incurred in 2014, organizations realized that they weren't quite as secure as they thought they might be. And I think that established a new precedent for diligence in organizations. As we all know, there were plenty of significant breaches, and organizations had a lot of impact. But I think that this shows a turning point in organizations' desire to improve security and not use it as more of an insurance policy. It becomes more of a proactive effect. And we have a lot of results that support this type of a conclusion, so we'll continue talking about those as well throughout the presentation. One of the things I think was key in the research was the impacts on confidence to detect alerts before significant impact. And as you can see, boom, big slice of the pie there. 50% said they get too many false positives. So ultimately, within the tools that they were currently using, one of the drivers for improved security was to get rid of false positives. As we know, those are a significant work driver in many organizations, and they also, pull us away from the events that are most important. So not only do they drive more unnecessary work, but they also pull us away from the things that have to really be focused on to gain the most effectiveness and security. We can see that 37% also said there were excessive or uncorroborated data and lack of context. And I think that drove a lot of change in tools as well. So if we have tools out there that are producing many alerts, let's say they're not false positive alerts, but they're just multiple alerts on the same item. Maybe they're correlated, maybe they're not. But ultimately what we're seeing here in that 37% is the fact that they felt like they were getting individual events without enough context around what was going on. An example of that might be something detecting from a network perspective an activity on a host, let's say malware. I'm seeing from a network side there might be malware on that system, but we don't have enough corroborating evidence on the endpoint to determine what was changed or if that attack was actually successful. That would be a good example of how we might have some information come across in one specific context, but we don't have enough to be able to understand for sure what the actual perspective was and impact was. 13% they had too many alerts. Well, I think that's also, of course, contributing to both those other two factors. If we have false alerts, that's going to add alerts. If we have uncorroborated or multiple alerts, that's also going to affect that as well. But I think that this is a specific and significant issue overall because all three of these combine detract from our ability to actually identify significant events, prioritize them, and respond. Very interesting enough, you can see here on the right-hand side of that nobody reported they didn't have enough data. And I think this indicates kind of a transition in security. For many, many years, it's been about getting bigger data. But at the same time, I think the respondents began to understand it's not so much about bigger data as it is about better data. And not that we can't gather more information from more different sources to gain that context, but that we need to make sure that the information we're gathering is useful and helpful in the situation, not just more data. Top 5 frustrations with IT security. So this is very interesting. And notice the first one that we have circled there, 43% said they don't have enough personnel. This was a constant theme in the report. Many situations revolved around the issue of not having enough physical personnel or not having enough skilled personnel. And you can see the third item specifically also addresses the fact that we have not enough personnel overall here with skills, right? So they're too hard to find, they're too difficult to retain. 34% said that. And then we get into the situation where 3 of these things have to do with tools. 1, we have insufficient tools at 39%. 2, too difficult to remediate and prioritize threats, which comes back to our volume of alerts and inability to correlate and so things like that. And then number 3 down here, too difficult to distinguish normal from abnormal activity. I think part of the key aspect of ongoing from, let's say, 2014 on is going to be this ability to distinguish normal from abnormal activity. And we're going to talk specifically to capabilities around that type of activity as we go throughout the presentation as well. So interestingly enough, talking about the staffing issues, here's a graph that depicts the position that we had from our respondents on staffing. 68% said they had some kind of impact from staffing issues, and we try to divide it up to get a little more granular. Tell us more about what's affecting you. So we'll take out this 32% here because they said, we're fine, which I was actually surprised it was that high, but I think that's great for those 32%. 13% flat out said we just can't fill them. We've got positions open, but there's no way to get the people. 30% said, hey, we're going to use less skilled personnel. So we understand that there's a growth curve here. We're willing to take someone that has a zeal or a zest or a talent for this kind of work, may not have the years of experience that we're looking for, but we're willing to put them in a seat so that we can move ahead and train them in-house to be able to do that job. And then 25% said they're impacted by churn. So they're finding staff. However, at the same time, those staff are leaving, and so they're unable to maintain their tribal knowledge or their flow of efficacy because the people that know what's going on as they come in, they get trained, and they leave. So I think these two are directly related here, in that you're going to continue to see people bringing personnel in that are less skilled. But then, unfortunately, I think what we'll see these moving out, and that comes back to what we can do from a budgetary perspective. It's now an employee market in security. We know that, and unfortunately, that means that you're going to have folks that are job hopping. This happened in the .com boom, very much the same effect. The IT personnel that were necessary to fuel all the .com whiz bang, they came in, they got trained up. And at some point in time, somebody else said, hey, we like your skills. We'll pay you 25%, 50% more, whatever it is, and they'd move on. And so I think we're going to see more of that in security as we go throughout the next few years. So be prepared for that from a budgetary perspective. And one of the things that we have to look at is you want to offer a fair wage at this point. Since there is almost no unemployment in security, I think companies are going to have to do that. The good news is we'll talk about budgets in general as well. So one of the things that seems to be driving upward is MSSP, Managed Security Service Providers. Adoption is increasing. If we don't have enough people, we either have to have better tools or we have to find somebody else to do it for us. And so we can see here that across the years between 2012 and 2015, we've had a significant increase per year basis and a huge jump between 2014 and 2015 in the number of organizations that are jumping into managed security services. So we see 29% of respondents said they said yes, we're going to use managed security services for all of our IT security requirements, and you can see that's a 123% increase from the previous year. That to me was a huge jump, and I think we're seeing that from a dollar perspective in the MSSP industry and the growth there. We are seeing growth in that area, so this supports that. And again, if we don't have enough personnel, it's either going to be tools or MSSPs, so there's a lot of folks that are going to MSSPs to try and outsource that particular function. I'm going to go through a couple of slides here that I think are very interesting. Now, the questions were asked, do you believe that this technology is available? This is not asking them if they have the technology or if they've seen the technology, but do they believe that the technology for these types of events exists out there? And I think this shows a very positive perspective on the marketplace in terms of tools. And I think that the respondents are generally correct. There are tools out there to provide these types of capabilities and functions. It's just a matter of being able to identify them, and that's really the hard part. We just got back from RSA a couple of weeks ago. There were hundreds of vendors out there showing their wares, and the messaging becomes very difficult from a consumer perspective to identify who has a technology that will fill their particular needs, and so that's an issue I think that from a security marketing perspective we face as consumers. But let me go through these fairly quickly because I don't think there's a lot of detail that's necessary here. But 79% said we believe that there is detection capability out, prevention capability out there, technology. So that's good. They think it's out there, which means they're looking for it. Next, we asked about detection capability. 83% said we think detection capabilities are out there. And I think it's key to mention that in both these cases that they're very high. It seems like the marketing message from a lot of vendors is give up on prevention. Detection is the new prevention. I don't think that's entirely true. In fact, I don't believe it's true at all. I think that there are preventative technologies out there that are available to help us with being able to understand what's happening both on the network side and on the endpoint side, and we'll talk about some of those technologies as we move further on in the presentation. But 83% said we believe detection capability is out there. 80% said we think that there are tools out there for effective incident response and prioritization. So I think that's good as well. And whether that's something as traditional as a SIM or whether that's moving into other security and risk management tools and ITGRC tools and security analytics and other things like that may give us corroborative evidence around what's going on, be able to prioritize. The tools are definitely out there. Do we have the tools available to distinguish normal from abnormal activity? Remember that was up there earlier as one of our items. 67% said we believe it's out there. Now, this was a significant drop compared to the others, right? We were talking in the 70s and 80s for the other technologies. So there's not as much confidence here, but people still believe it's out there. And this is where we get into a number of different types of technologies, which I'll go through those when we get to our really cool charts and kind of the meat of our presentation. But these are all leading up to show that the people believe the tools are out there. And ultimately, I believe as an analyst that the tools are out there as well. And it's just up to us to be able to wade through the marketing fluff to be able to get to the right vendors. Are the tools available to address lack of personnel? Well, 79% said, yeah, I think there are. And I believe there are as well. Automation is key. Automated response is key, and then ultimately correlating events and analyzing events to the point where we get down to specific issues that we need to address and be able to prioritize those, drive this lack of ability to overcome the lack of personnel. And this is going to continue to be an issue over the next few years because we're not training up people any faster, unfortunately, and the jobs in this area are growing significantly since we're being experiencing issues on multiple fronts, whether that's from a nation-state perspective or organized crime or just individuals that are attacking for either socio-political means or other reasons. 18, are there tools available to provide meaningful security info to business stakeholders? This has always been and continuously is an issue for security personnel. I think this is one of the common issues I hear around security is the security folks and the business folks are not able to sufficiently align. The business folks tell us, hey, the security people are not telling me how they're spending the money effectively to improve my security. They tell me they've got this thing of technology, whatever they said it was, and business people don't really, many don't align with technology very well. They understand business risk and money and issues and events and so forth, but they don't understand technology necessarily. So security folks have often approached it from a technology perspective. Hey, we've got antivirus, we've got endpoint threat detection and response, we've got security analytics, or we've got whatever the technology is, but they don't do a good job of saying this is how this technology is now going to improve us from a security standpoint and reduce our risk. And so I think this particular slide is key from that perspective to help us understand that we do have tools out there that can help us to be able to provide meaningful information to the stakeholders. And security risk management and IT GRC tools are some of the tools there that can help us in this particular area. Next question. So what is affecting us from an organizational perspective? Why aren't we able to perform? 46% said, hey, I can't get the tools I need because I have insufficient budget. 44% said I can't find the right tools. And then only 10% said we don't believe the tools exist in general. And I think this supports our individual questions above because those percentages were very high. This particular percentage of we don't believe that they exist is very small. So looking at it from an inverse perspective, they align pretty well. And it's interesting how insufficient budget is almost evenly split with can't find the right tools. Right? So from that perspective, I think there are definitely issues. However, interestingly enough, we're finding that budgets again are pretty strong, and I have a couple slides on that. So we're pretty evenly split between budget and tools, but I think ultimately, we're going to end up seeing an issue around more so around people trying to find the right tools in the budget because the money appears to be out there, the economy is doing pretty well, and budgets are increasing. So this one was pretty surprising to us from a response perspective. We asked if people were creating CSIRCs or SOCs. So CSIRC is a Computer Security Incident Response Center or a SOC, Security Operations Center. Dedicated personnel that are there to respond to incidents and deal with incident analysis, incident response. 73% said yes, we have one. Or my perception on this is, or we want to have one. Because there's a shortage in staff, it's very difficult for me to say that all 73% of these companies have fully staffed SOCs. They may have an organization created, they may have some headcount in place, but given the other pressures we've seen on headcount, it appears that most of these organizations are understaffed for providing that type of a response center. We talked about budgets, so here's where the rubber hits the road, right? So the question is about IT budgets, not security budgets. That's the next slide. But in IT budgets, we are seeing that the budgets are still increasing. If you look at this particular graph, we see that 29 and 30% of the organizations responded and said that they had between a 10 to 25% increase or a less than 10% increase. So somewhere greater than zero, but less than 25%, you have 59% of your organizations. And if you look at that chart, you can see it kind of shifts over from the previous years just a little bit in terms of that height going from right to left. So that curve has moved over. Most of the organizations, in terms of average, seem to fall in that 10 to 25% increase in IT budgets. So we know that their funding is out there, and I'll show you as a follow-up slide at the very end. I'll just show you how that kind of relates to the executive branch and how they're funding the organizations. But I think this was very, very clear in that the IT budgets are out there and they're being funded to improve overall IT. And then we dug down in deeply to find out more about security budgets and as a percentage of IT budgets and whether or not they're being increased. And we found that security budgets are also being increased as well. And you can see that from the previous years, we're seeing a spike in that number. So looking down here in the previous year in 2012, we were spiked up here. This was a little flat. It moved out in 2014, which is great because if it hadn't, I think we would have seen worse responses and worse issues and compromise in 2014. So we got a little more budget. And then here you can see that we've spiked out above that that less than 10%. So overall, we're still right in this area for budgets. So they're just over 10%, so that 10 to 15% range, which is great. So IT budgets are still increasing. The average is about, I think it's 14-point-something% increase in security budgets over the previous year. That's great for security from a tools perspective or other requirements perspective. Again, we can't make people faster, but at least the economy is improving, so dollars are there to help us to address the issues that we have in place. So what were the top 5 use cases for security technologies? We asked about 18 different categories of technology, which I'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. But ultimately, I aggregated those results to see across the board what were our responses. So the first one is use cases enhancing breach or compromise response. I think that's key. If you look at all the advanced persistent attacks and advanced threats and all the things going on, this was a key issue: is how do we identify that something has happened earlier? The major breaches that we've seen in the newspapers, it looks like they have been in place for months prior to discovery. So if we can reduce that window, we can reduce losses, we can reduce impact, and all those types of things. So ultimately, by being able to identify them earlier, we're going to be much better off. Enhancing or accelerating post-incident forensics. So once something's happened, how do we get there faster and understand what happened? Enhancing breach or compromise detection, very similar to the incident response, right? Those two go hand in hand. Providing highly actionable, intelligent, or context for incident prioritization. That goes along with getting rid of the false positives and then ultimately being able to prioritize. And then improving the long-term trend or anomaly analysis, so I can see what's been going on in the past to help me identify what's different now and ultimately be able to see that normal activity difference from the abnormal activity. Where are we looking for the top 3 respondents? So what we asked respondents is, who should you look to, or who are you looking to give us the most improvement in security? And interestingly enough, 51% said we really expect our technology vendors to be able to give it to us. And I think that's a wise choice, though there are definitely influences from third-party IT services and from security industry organizations such as ISACA, ISC Squared, and other things that will influence. Ultimately, the most improvement is going to come from the technology. If we have better technology, we're going to be able to deal with the staffing shortages. And even the MSSPs need better technology to be able to deal with the vast number of alerts that they're dealing with across their multiple customers. So it really is going to come down to how does the technology help us to improve in our capabilities to be able to prevent, detect, and respond to events. What were the top 5 drivers for lack of value? So this means that someone bought a tool and they said, you know what, we really didn't get the value out of it that we expected. Here's why. Well, there's no surprise, right? Too many false positives at the top of the list. We saw that earlier in terms of other questions that we asked. Interestingly enough, we also had inadequate security data to business impact correlation. So we get an event, but we really don't know what the business impact is. Is this something that's going to cripple us for minutes, hours, days, weeks? Is it going to cost us hundreds of dollars or millions of dollars? Thirdly, inadequate staff to receive the necessary ROI. One of the things we found in this particular study was that organizations would purchase tools, and then they wouldn't necessarily, but prior to purchasing them, they wouldn't go through the requirements process properly to identify the staff they were going to need to support them, the expertise, and or the multi-organizational support, especially in the larger organizations where you have multiple IT shops that are compartmentalized, if you will, and someone wants to buy a tool that's going to reach across multiple sectors of the enterprise, and they don't engage the other resources such that they have the necessary information and connections and data feeds to get the most value out of the tool. Technology can't handle the volume of data collected. That was interesting. That seems to come back more to, again, a scoping issue. We didn't understand what we were trying to do before we bought the technology, and so we either didn't buy enough infrastructure to support it, or the technology itself didn't have enough capability. It did well at its job, but it was really meant for a smaller scale, that type of thing. And lastly, we have inadequate visibility into threats, ingress or egress that propagate in our environment. So we bought a technology to try and help us identify advanced targeted attacks or advanced persistent threats, but ultimately we didn't buy the right tool for the job, and we aren't able to see how these events are moving through our environment. A lot of times you'll hear that expressed as lateral movement and that type of thing. Okay, so here's where the rubber hits the road and what a lot of people are asking about. in terms of the report. These are the 18 categories of tools. If I spent time going through each individual category, I'd probably run out of time before the end of our webinar. So I want you to take a look at this, and I've seen the question asked if these slides will be available. So yes, there will be slides available, so you can go back and review the webinar. But ultimately, I added antivirus to this because I thought it would be very interesting to watch what happened with antivirus. A few years ago, antivirus is in the 95 to 98 percentile in terms of deployment. Only 61% of the organizations that had technology had still had antivirus. So that's a huge drop. We can see that's a declining technology, and the report talks about why that's a declining technology, what the dissatisfiers are, and so forth. Interestingly enough, there's a couple things that I wanted to point out here is this low saturation, high customer value area, and that's down here in yellow. Now, these particular technologies are growing rapidly, and they have a lot of market potential for value as well as efficacy within your environments, depending upon what types of issues you're having and you're trying to control. The culmination here is the fact that they have just enough market deployment, so they have a solid customer base. And this isn't speaking to any particular company because there are multiple companies in each one of these areas. But the technologies as a whole have gotten enough traction to where they're growing. They have a significant market hold. And there's also a high value or high number of people that understand or know about the technology. They may not be experts on it, but they've heard about it, and they understand, at least to some degree, what it is. So you have a good growth base. You have a good understanding. And also efficacy around these technologies and the services and products they provide, belowhand to help us with security. Now, interestingly enough, we also asked about value, right? Value's deployed out here, so what kind of value are we getting out of it? And this is, I think, my other key slide from the report. You notice here in the top we have circled, we had 3 technologies that tied for first place at 2.23 out of 3 points total value. Advanced security and threat analytics and anomaly detection. Huge field, high growth, lots and lots of value. Organizations are seeing the capabilities here in being able to take multiple points of information, put it together, provide context, and say, this is your highest issue right now because of all these data points that we have. You need to go do something, right, to try and eliminate that whole false positive, uncorroborated issues. Security analytics addresses most, if not all, of the top 5 items. Cloud data encryption, a big one. That's kind of the thank you, Mr. Snowden. Right, folks have really been pushing on various types of encryption, and since cloud is being pushed forward, and we have also the issue with governments trying to access data on the backside, cloud data encryption. People say, hey, I'm buying it, it's working well, it's really helped me. The other third one that tied for top is threat intelligence service feed. That was a big one as well. There's a number of vendors that provide this type of information. There's open source, but the key is being able to get the information, distill it down to useful quantities and quality, and then be able to put that into your system. I think that's really been the biggest argument around threat intelligence service feeds, because there can be millions and millions of events that come through from the various feeds. There's duplicate information, and so really the key is looking at a vendor who can distill that down into a useful amount of information for you. I think one of the biggest shiners here, aside from security analytics, was the EDTR, Endpoint Threat Detection Response. A couple of years ago, we got a lot of feedback or input, I should say, from the marketing folks that said, hey, endpoint's dead, give up on prevention, we're going to move to the network, we're going to drop back, and it's kind of like the whole idea of a siege, right? You give up the wall at the front to go to the castle on the inside. Well, we'll give up the castle and just move to the woods. It's okay. And ultimately, the problem is if you give up the endpoint, there's not much left. The transactions happen on the endpoint, the changes happen on the endpoint, data is stolen from the endpoint, and so endpoint threat detection response was at 9th place last year in the report, and people realized, well, hey, this whole marketing message of give up on the prevention, give up on the endpoint is stupid. And I don't mean to offend anybody with that, so I hope I don't, but ultimately I have to agree with that in that if we give up on the endpoint, what's really left? Everything happens there. So endpoint jumped from 9th place to tied for 2nd place and took the prize for the highest increase in value. People began to realize that marketing message was not a great idea. Not that we don't need to use the network information because it's very valuable for early detection and other things like that, and potentially preventing events as well, but we also need to defend that endpoint. Even if the best technology were only 80% effective, which is better than what people are claiming antivirus is, then you're still 80% better than if you had nothing. So I think that this particular category jumped up, and you should really look at the vendors in this space because we do want to protect those endpoints. Network APT, the network advanced persistent threat vendors, they moved up a little as well, but not as much. I think they moved up one space, but they tied for second place. Then you can see from there we kind of go down and pour antiviruses at the bottom of the scale in terms of mean value. And people are realizing that antivirus may be required in certain environments because of your auditors, but the auditors are getting smarter, and we're looking at new technologies, and so antivirus is still kind of losing ground and becomes more of a commodity service, if you will. So looking at the information a little different way, that was the mean in terms of taking the number of customers that had expected value, greater than expected value, and less than expected value, weighting those and coming out with a number. This just says the number of technology owners that said we got greater than expected value. So cloud data encryption was at the top from that perspective, threat intelligence service feed, and you can read down a list. But none of these are shabby, and the only difference is that in this only takes into account specifically expected value or greater than expected value. It does not take into account the proportion that also said we received less than expected value, and that's what kind of moved these numbers around on the other chart. But I thought it was important to note the fact that cloud data encryption received a lot of value, and so did threat intelligence service feed. Provided you get your requirements right, ultimately you can get to the place where you have a solid piece of technology that can help protect your information. Decline in security baseline. So looking at this kind of vertically, we have the years here, right? This is 2012, this is 2014, this is 2015. Each one of these lines represents a different level of competence in defining a security baseline. The dark purple line is that we've done everything we can, right? We've established multiple comprehensive baselines across our domains. Notice that over time, this has been declining. A little drop over the course of the first two reports, a large drop here. And so ultimately it's showing us that because of the lack of personnel and a lack of tools, and that, whether driven by budget or other things, we're doing less baselining, which ultimately causes us a problem. Why does that cause the problem? Because it gives us an inability to identify our key assets and then be able to identify the high priority threats against those assets. So we can see a correlation between the fact that we're maintaining fewer baselines of security configurations in our environment, and then ultimately we're unable to determine which of these assets that's being threatened has the greatest impact to our environment, and also which of these threats is greatest. So these threats, these issues directly correlate between the two. I think that's a very important aspect. So we do need to have tools out there that will help us to identify the issues in our environment, the assets in our environment, and then ultimately understand what those security configurations are so we can better prioritize, better identify, and respond to those threats and events. Success in correlating incident to business risks. We showed that was a problem earlier, and so this is the good, the bad, and the ugly of that particular. Only 20% of organizations said they feel they're consistently successful in correlating an incident to business risk, right? So this system was compromised, or there was an unauthorized change on this system, or whatever it was, and we understand that given that's happened, here's what the impact of the business is. Right? We're going to have to take this service offline. That's going to cost us, $1,000 or $1 million or whatever it is. 58% we're kind of balanced. We think we're successful more often than we are unsuccessful, and that's okay, right? It's not great, but it's okay. But then we get down here to the other parts, and we see 16%, 5%, and 1% basically are at some level of we just aren't doing this well. And that it means that we're going to be unsuccessful, I think, in promoting ourselves as a security organization. We're going to be unsuccessful in obtaining additional budget that we may need because ultimately, again, the business people understand business risk, business issues. If the security folks can't make that correlation, then other folks that are going to be competing for those dollars are probably going to get them. This was very interesting as well. So this is suite solutions versus point solutions, the top 5 significant frustrations with IT security technologies, and this is how they relate to point solutions versus suite solutions. So what happens is lack of integration. Well, we like point solutions because they deliver more depth, right? They're let's say an inch wide and a mile deep versus a mile wide and an inch deep. This is great. We love it. However, the problem is we have these stacks of information now from these security tools, and they don't give us enough context across the board, so we need the ability to integrate those. So we're looking for technologies that can help us, or we're looking for integrations that can help us go between these tools. So when you look at the point solution tools that do a certain thing, make sure you talk to them about with their integrations and what other tools they integrate with, not just a SIM tool or something like that, but are there other types of tools, whether they're network or endpoint or whatever it is, data classification, etc. There's 18 different tools I mentioned here. There's far more classifications, but ultimately you want to make sure that you have these integrations. When we look at the suite products, right, unable to recognize new emerging threats. People went to the suites because they wanted one interface to rule them all. And that's great from an efficacy perspective, but they also found out with them trying to maintain so many different tools, they weren't able to get as deep, right? They were now a mile wide, the inch deep. The reverse situation said, well, hey, if you're going to do this, we need you to be more nimble. We need you to have better information about emerging threats, better updates to your technology. So that was the complaint against the suite providers. Too many alerts or events for uncorrelated data, right? So from that perspective, the suites, again, if they're detecting a lot of stuff very wide, but they aren't able to go as deep to really corroborate what they're detecting, so they get more false positive, too many alerts, that kind of thing. Number 4 down here, tools are unable to provide appropriate reporting, right? So the suite providers, because they have a broader width, can put all this data together and produce very nice reporting across multiple scenarios and situations and data stacks. The point solutions, not so good, right? They need an integration. They need some kind of centralized repository to put that in, and SIM was one good aspect of that as well. There's security analytics is another, but ultimately we need the ability to get that information together so we can provide these comprehensive reports about our security status. Too difficult to distinguish which security actions or policies are working. This was across the board to both. It's like, we have this great stack of information from our point. We have this great breadth, but ultimately we need the ability to be able to take this information, determine which controls are being effective and which aren't. And so there was kind of a balance in that between both, kind of a nip against both providers there, ultimately something they need to work on. Frustrations are going down. So this is actually pretty cool. If you look at the trend between 2012 and 2015, in 2012, the frustration about vendors being slow to deal with emerging threats, 39% versus 24% in 2015. So that's a really nice fact. Vendors are getting better. They recognize the fact that the landscape is moving faster. The threats are getting faster, bigger, better, stronger, nastier. And so they're being quicker to respond. And so that's great that vendors have heard that, and they're able to do that. The point solution vendors are faster than the suite providers, but I think that as a whole, the industry is getting better. Looking down here, too difficult to distinguish which controls and policies are working. We've gotten a little better there, right? 12 points better. So between 2012 and 2015, we've improved. So we're getting better tools and better reporting and better capabilities to be able to do that. And then ultimately, you can see that the point solution providers are partnering, they're integrating, they're enhancing their capabilities, and the suite providers are they've already got the data. They're just trying to get deeper so they can understand more about what's going on and produce that kind of reporting and information. Does security know what it doesn't know? So these are the top 3 most needed to improve InfoSec as a discipline. You can see that we have a bad trend going on here. It's effectively labeled as a bad trend with red and arrows in the whole 9 yards. So we can see that in 2012, we said 28% said we need more use of real-time intelligence. Well, after the year of the breach, and you can see it kind of continued upwards, 42%, we really still need more use of real-time intelligence. We need tools to gather better information and faster. And how does that driven? Well, it's driven by we need better integration of technology. So we mentioned it a little bit earlier in a different context, but you can see this concern is growing as well over the course of time. We think we've got good technology out there, but we don't need silos. The silos are killing us. Let's get it all together so we can ultimately present a comprehensive picture to our security management, our IT management, and ultimately our business management. And then better ability to recognize targeted threats. Well, we could almost see that coming given 2014 being the year of the breach again. Again, this jumped up significantly over the course of the 3 years because we realized that we don't necessarily know what we thought we knew. There are gaps in our information. There are gaps in our visibility, so we need to be better at gathering information, putting it together, and being able to provide a comprehensive analysis. One of the things that came out very strongly, I mentioned the fact that endpoint threat detection response jumped up from 9th to 2nd. Interesting enough, when we look at the questions around what do you want for improving or accelerating breach detection versus detecting malicious threat actors versus accelerating incident response and getting better incident context, endpoint threat detection response was number 1 in the 3 categories, and number 2 in the third, right? So, or in the fourth, excuse me. So from that perspective, we can see that the folks did understand that endpoint threat detection response was a solid technology to look at. And when you combine that with the capabilities of integrating and putting that into an analytics platform, you're really creating a huge, solid base to be able to defend your organization from all aspects, from prevention, detection, and response. Market assessment, top reasons why security analytics is needed. Improves compliance management. Well, we know that there's a lot of organizations that deal with compliance, and so they spoke up and said, analytics is awesome because we can get the information together, we can distill it down, and we can produce reports to our auditors that help us to stay in compliance, and it speeds up the process. Improves productivity and efficiency of IT efforts. Well, if you're going to reduce your false positives, distill information down, right, you can see how that's going to improve your productivity rather than dealing with 10,000 events and having to sort through them and getting 5 done because you've now been able to prioritize some of them. You're taking those 10,000 events, running it through analytics, bringing it down to literally 1/100th of the amount, let's say 10 events, and then being able to say, okay, what can we do with these? I should say from 10,000 to 100 or whatever the proportion is, but you get the idea. We're talking multiple factors of 10 increase in ability to refine those down and get them down, or reduction in alerts. Strategic decision making, absolutely. Improving defense against targeted threats, right? If you have all the information together and you can prioritize it, that should definitely improve your capabilities there. And then lastly, aids in identification of previously unseen issues. Right? Well, that's the whole idea behind analytics. We're trying to take these pockets of data that we have, put them together, and then say, okay, how do we, what's different? What's going on? And I kind of look at it like the old Sesame Street thing when one of these kids is doing his own thing. That's the whole idea behind the anomaly detection and what's going on out there. So you're going to look at the behaviors either of entities. An entity could be software, it could be a system, it could be a person. But you're going to look at those and ultimately be able to identify why this particular entity is acting differently than other entities on the network that may have similar functions, similar roles, etc. Okay, so this is kind of our great slide at the end. Where's show me the money, as it says in the movie, right, with Tom Cruise. So when we looked at how C-levels are now driving financial support of security, we can see that, interesting enough, there was kind of a drop here in most of in the 2014 area, and so that was pretty interesting to note that between 2012 and 2014 there was a drop. And by the way, on this list we can finding hit from the year of the breach perspective. So when we say that 2014, this was done at the beginning of 2014, there was less money invested, there were a huge number of breaches. What happened? Oh my gosh, we've been compromised. There's all kinds of crazy stuff going on. So every level of management, here from board of directors through CEO, et cetera, said we need to invest in security. We've done ourselves a disservice by not putting money in the pocket for this, or in the bucket for this, and so we're going to do it. And I think a lot of that was not only just the scope of breaches and the volume of breaches, but we also started to see the first impacts on executive level exits, whether that's a dismissal or a voluntary action, or whatever it is. I'm not going there, but the whole point was it did affect the jobs. And so if it's going to affect jobs, they're going to say, hey, if I'm going to be held truly accountable for these types of things, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to do everything in my power to maintain my revenue stream, maintain the business, and so forth. And so when I have to stand up in front of people, if something does happen, I can say we did everything possible and funded this and so forth. And so, as an individual, I'm not on the hook wherever the individual is. All right, well, we appreciate you being here, and I think we're right at time, but I have enough time for a couple of questions if anybody wants to throw those up. I hope you get a chance to go to the site, look at the reports. The sponsors have summary reports that are available from their websites as well that talk about specifically about their areas of technology. I think these are awesomely informative, and not the fact that I wrote it. I haven't quite finished the full report yet, so I apologize for that, but we are going to post that as soon as possible to get that out to everybody. And it's very nicely drawn up so that you can look at individual areas of technologies, various analyses, and so it's not like reading a vast tome. You can actually break it up into digestible chunks. But I appreciate everybody's time. Are there any questions? Do we have time, Raleigh?
Yes, we are just at the allocated time frame for this event, but let's take one question. David, when looking at the drivers for dissatisfaction or lack of value, are there any organizational issues that came up other than staff?
Yes, and I kind of alluded to that in the presentation as well, but let me drill down for just a moment. I think other than staff and putting budget off to the side, the key issue with these technologies is to identify your requirements first. You have to have the appropriate due diligence, and ultimately, if you assume that you came from one environment and a technology worked really well, so it's going to work in a new environment, that's a poor assumption to make. It might be good to give you your short list or help you with that, but when you move from environment to environment, there's very few things that are exactly the same. So in many cases, you don't want to make that assumption. So I think the key takeaway there is make sure you sit down with the appropriate people and gather the requirements from security and from the business so that you understand exactly what the problem is you're trying to solve and whether the technology that you're buying is really going to address the core issues or if you're just addressing some kind of superficial symptom of the problem. It may be that it's a people issue or a process issue, not a tools issue. But ultimately, if you do need a tool to solve the problem, you want to make sure you have the best fit for your environment.
Great. Thank you, David. And I wanted to thank our audience for joining us today. You will receive a follow-up email from EMA tomorrow that will include some of the resources from today's event. Also, as David mentioned, the report is not currently available, but you will receive an email notifying you when it is. So be on the lookout for that email as well. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.